This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to real institutions is purely coincidental. She moves through the market as if she belongs there. No hurry, no badge peeking from under her coat, just a plain tote bag and the kind of face people ignore when the city is in motion. The air is warm and bruised with the taste of frying oil and citrus. A brazier hisses at a corner stall, and someone 2 stalls down hums an old radio jingle that breads through the crowds. Juliana Morais listens with a professional patience she learned long ago. Attention is a tool. Today she is a passerby, a customer, a neighbor. Today she is nothing more than an ordinary woman buying breakfast. Antonio, Antenor, everyone calls him, runs a narrow food cart under a striped umbrella that smells of palm oil and garlic. His hands are quick and sure. He peels a plantain with a rhythm that looks practiced. He jokes with a construction worker about last night's football match and slides a paper-wrapped fritter into Juliana's hand with the easy courtesy of someone who has kept a corner of the neighborhood fed for 20 years. His eyes are honest in a face mapped by the sun. He offers change and a story about his daughter learning 3 letters of the alphabet that week. Juliana smiles and pays enough for him to insist she didn't have to. It is commonplace life, the small transactions that hold a city together. The music, the metal of the cart, the damped heat pressing against everyone. Then, as if the day has been interrupted by something intolerable, 2 police motorcycles curve through the crowd like knives. The sound slices the market's coherence. People step aside the way you step aside for a wave about to pass you. Claudio Bastos arrives first, local police chief, a short, wide man with a mustache that tightens like a noose when he speaks. His uniform is overconfident, gold braid polished to show he means business. Cabo Ribera trails, a younger, taut-faced man who knows how strength looks on a street. Escrivá Amaral follows, notebook in hand, eyes already calculating the story he will tell when the day is done. They have the swagger of men who taste power and decide the flavor is theirs.
Antenor laughs, a short, surprised sound. "I barely make rent, sir." Ribeiro nudges the cart with a boot. A stack of paper plates kebs. The oil spatters. Someone near the fruit stands has a soft, helpless prayer. Bastos reaches toward the umbrella and rips the striped fabric in a quick, theatrical movement. It slaps against Antenor's face. The crowd's chatter collapses into a single, stunned silence. Juliana doesn't plan to be dramatic. She plans to observe. She plans to document. But when Bastos lays a heavy palm on Antenor's shoulder and lifts it as if to make him bow, something in her answers. A prosecutor's reflex. Dignity is not abstract. It is the thin, stubborn habit of how people stand when no one is looking. "Hey," she says, low and clear, crossing to the cart as if she is making a necessary purchase. "Cut that out. He's not hurting anyone." Bastos turns. He looks at her like an insect that has crawled into his coffee. "You mind your business, ma'am." "No." Juliana keeps her voice even, the way an investigator keeps a steady hand on the pen. "This is his business. You have no right." Ribeiro laughs. It is not a happy sound. "You think you can tell me about rights?" Bastos steps forward and places the back of his hand against Juliana's cheek, the way a stage director taps a prop into place. The slap is quick, and it is meant to be everything, a public correction, an example. It silences the market in the same way a bell silences a room, sharp and final. When the impact happens, time distorts. A paper cup spins from a sidewalk seller's hand. A child begins to cry but is hushed. Antenor drops his change and bends like a man suddenly trimmed at the knees. Juliana's mouth tastes of oil and shock. Her cheek reddens. For a stunned second she hears nothing but the muted drum in her own ears, the faint clinical certainty that registries will note this as resisting an officer, a phrase that means less than the bruise on a human cheek. Bastos doesn't stop. He pulls at Juliana's coat as if it were a billboard, shoving her into the police truck that idles with a complaining engine. The crowd watches the choreography of humiliation. Some record with phones, some whisper things that sound like prayers, and others that sound like curses. Antenor stands very still, his hands curled over a bent coin. A woman near the flower stall throws a paper napkin at Bastos and misses. "Take her in," Bastos orders, and his voice circles like a hawk. "Teach her a lesson." They jam her into the van like she is another piece of refuse. The back doors slam. The truck's metal smells of stale coffee and the ghost of vinyl seats. It rocks into motion, and the market resumes the uncertain orbit of its day. But nothing is the same. There are people who will not look at the empty space where Juliana stood. Others clutch their own lists and count purchases as a defense. If you believe in justice, subscribe. If this matters to you, follow the work that follows it.
The van ride is a narrow corridor of heat and prohibition. The men in uniform trade jokes that sound like barbed wire. Ribera repeats the slap as if proud of a script he has finally performed. Amaro, with his pen still at the ready, jokes about paperwork and how the city needs to be cleaned. Their voices bounce off the caged windows. Juliana keeps her breathing even. She lets them believe her small. She is not small, she is deliberate. There are things a prosecutor cannot do in public without risking everything. Walk into a courtroom shouting, brandish evidence without authority, make accusations into cameras without procedure. There are other things she can do in secret. Observe, collect, listen, let people tell their own stories. Juliana understands the ethics as clearly as she understands the law. The undercover move is temporary, surgical. It is not vengeance, it is a method. She has chosen to disguise herself among the city's ordinary people to see how the people who are supposed to enforce justice behave when no one from the judiciary is watching. When she is pushed into the precinct, the building smells of floor wax gone sour and of people who have become used to being bored by their own power. The front desk is a partition with a callous-eyed officer who flips through papers like a bored archivist. A fan turns in the ceiling and moves the dust in lazy, resigned circles. Her cuffs get tightened, then loosened, the ritual of humiliation dressed as procedure. Amaro takes the booking photograph with an almost affectionate cruelty, catalog-like. He writes a name he doesn't believe. Juliana offers a name that is hers. It's a small theft to give him what he expects and keep her truth inside. The mugshot is poorly lit. The camera catches the bruise on her cheek as if it were a relic. She does not confess who she is. She will not hand over what could stop the mechanism now. Her refusal is not stubbornness. It is strategy. There are other cells in the precinct, and each contains urgencies that the city would rather not see. In the ward where Juliana is placed, the walls hum with the small, private disasters of ordinary citizens. The light is thin, and the bed is a metal plank with blankets that have lost fight to the laundry. Smells mix, cheap soap, the tang of stale sweat, the powdered scent of someone trying to be clean. Donna Lucia sits with a paper scarf around her neck and a plastic bag at her feet. Her hands are maps, veins like old roads, knuckles slightly swollen from years of work and weather. Her voice, when it comes, is small and direct. She mentions names with the ease of a memory whose repetition keeps it honest. They came 3 times last month, she says. They asked for 500 on Tuesday, 200 on Thursday. Told me if I didn't give it, they'd take my stall, take the money for the medications. Her eyes find Juliana's like a vessel pushing questions across a harbor. I pay what I can. My son, he's sick.
The doctor needs. Juliana listens. She writes the dates inside her head, the small numbering that will become evidence if she ever gets it on paper. She notes the patrol numbers, the time of day, the small redundancy in the officers' lines. Donna Lucia's story is not an isolated complaint. It is a component in a pattern. Across from her sits Carla, a younger woman whose shoulders carry the weight of someone who's been asked to carry more than her share. She fidgets with the hem of her sleeve like a person straightening an invisible crease. Her voice leaks out in halting parts. They said he'd take the blame if I signed, Carla says, words coming out like concessions. They wanted a confession. He's the one who pays the boys at the club. They told me if I didn't, they'd put me away for a long time. My brother, he needs work. I can't lose him. Juliana catches the name of the man Carla half mentions. Here's the code and how the coercion is phrased. Fabricated charges in exchange for protection. The language of leverage. She realizes how the corrupt mechanism protects other corrupt actors, men with influence who can buy silence by handing a scapegoat to the police. She does not identify herself. Not yet. There is a cost to revelation too. It brings their attention, and attention can be violent. In the cell, stories intertwine like threads in a tapestry that has been ripped and retouched for years. Donna Lucia describes the hail of extortion in patient detail, how payments arrived in envelopes, how receipts were falsified, how the threat of arrest hangs like a clock at noon. She mentions a pattern of officers showing up in pairs, more likely at day's end when the vendors are tired, the till light with change and the coins of those who cannot count on tomorrow. Antenor's voice from outside, a small, scared sound, reverberates in Juliana's mind. Carla's narrative is rawer, edged with shame. She speaks of being handed a paper and told to sign as if it were nothing, as if a signature were a small, unimportant thing. It was the only way, she says,
and the sentence collapses in a way that proves it false. Juliana imagines the paper back then, how easily a signature is manufactured into guilt, how a coerced mark on a page becomes a tool to be used against someone. Every word is a breadcrumb. Juliana takes mental notes, dates, amounts, the exact phrasing officers used when they demanded money, the cadence of the bribe. She listens for names of places where money exchanges hands, for the telltale repetition of a businessman's name whispered in the background of a threatened conversation. Her job is to take these human testimonies and transmute them into a map the authorities cannot ignore. It is not a heroic process. It is a meticulous, careful accumulation of small facts until they sit in a pile heavy enough to break the arc of corruption. Juliana's training tells her how to do this. Her conscience tells her why.
At night, in the thin light bleeding through a barred window, she thinks about the choices that led her to the market and a fake blouse and a new scarf. People like her, public servants who chose risk, are rare. She remembers the meetings, the reports dismissed as anecdotes, the patterns softened by official apathy, the memos that suggested more community outreach when what was needed were investigations. She remembers seeing a vendor's ledger once, the careful arithmetic of a small business that could be wiped out in one raid, one fine, one arbitrary seizure. She thinks of Antenor's daughter learning letters, of Dona Lucia's hands, of Carla's brother needing work. These are not just footnotes. They are the index of why the law exists at all, to preserve the conditions of ordinary life against the abuses of power. Her phone is simple, because a complex device is an attractor of suspicion. She knows how to manage risk. She also knows the ethics. No entrapment, no unnecessary deception. She will not humiliate for sport or gossip. She is there to see and to preserve evidence. Still, she is not naive. The men who shoved her into the truck do not care about ethics. They care about protection. Protection for themselves and the powerful who feed them. Back in the cell, night comes, and with it the small illusions of privacy. The other women talk softly about the things that make them human. A son's birthday, a neighbor's cat, a bread recipe that smells like home. Juliana keeps her notes inward, cataloging the sounds, the timbre of each accusation, the uncomfortable little lies that come with survival. She does not promise miracles. She promises to listen, to remember, to try. When morning arrives, it brings with it the smell of coffee and a new kind of noise, a reporter on the street outside, the hum of someone trying to make a narrative of what happened. News travels like water. When a dam opens, streams of attention follow. Juliana, still in the cell, hears the distant rise of shouts through the precinct's thin walls. Names begin to appear, and they stick to the air like pollen. On the other side of the city, Clara, young, hungry for a story that means something, has been tipped off. Antenor, who had fallen back into the market after the truck left, had found the nerve to make a call and a plea. He has called a number he found scribbled on a community board, the number of a journalist who once wrote about neighborhood struggles. Clara had given him a simple promise: "I'm coming." She arrives with a phone and a courage that is brittle and brilliant. Clara's camera finds the strip of the market where the cart stood, an umbrella twisted, some paper plates strewn like discarded petals. Her voice is steady in the way youth can be, a mixture of outrage and disbelief that the city still tolerates such scenes. She live streams, and the numbers climb in the small rectangle of the screen, comments popping like nails hammered into a plank.
Strangers across the city and beyond type short, furious messages. Unbelievable. This is wrong. Where is oversight? The feed becomes a growing, noisy chorus. Viewers press like hands at a locked door. Outside the precinct, Clara's live stream collides with the police's intention to control the narrative. Bastos's office scrambles to keep the message tidy. They spin a release. The woman interfered with an officer doing his duty. She resisted arrest and was taken in for questioning. It is a familiar choreography, a script that keeps the powerful safe by shrinking the story to a single, controllable headline. Inside, Juliana watches the cell's small television, left there like a piece of charity, and sees the first frames of Clara's feed. The camera angle is raw, the comments are sharp. The feed shows the twisted umbrella, Antenor holding his cap, pointing at the plaza where the cart used to be. A flurry of emojis, angry faces, hands pressed together, appear across the bottom of the screen. The image is imperfect, but it carries the electric charge of public attention. In Juliana's mind, the live video is the faintest sliver of light beneath the locked door. She sits in the dim and plans. There are rules she must follow, institutional pathways, legal formalities that protect a case from collapsing into a word.
There is also a human law. There must be witnesses who will not be ignored. The market's live stream could be a needle that tears open the seam and lets the truth spill out. Or it could be another thing to be smothered by lie and procedure. Juliana needs to thread the live feed into the rigid machine of accountability without letting it become a sideshow. The precinct tries to manage the spectacle in its own way. They shuffle paperwork, they produce a hurried false release for the benefit of some curious neighbors. Bastos issues a statement that sounds like a promise. We are looking into the matter. It is the kind of statement that buys time. Time is precisely what Juliana will not allow to stretch without pressure. In the cell, she continues the work that has been given to her by accident and intention. She takes the details she has gleaned, Donna Lucia's envelopes, and Tenor's timetable, Carla's alleged confession, and starts to weave them into a pattern. She files names inside a mental folder: Ribeiro, the boot, the laughter; Amaral, the smirk, the paperwork; the times, first week of May, late afternoon; the amounts, small, precise payments that become significant once multiplied over weeks and months. As she listens to the other women, Juliana forms promises she intends to keep. She tells Donna Lucia the sorts of things women like her need to be told. We will document. We will do it carefully. She tells Carla, with a certainty she feels in her bones, that forced confessions can be challenged, that paper can be countered with testimony, with chain of custody, with witnesses who did not benefit from the lie.
The words are a small liturgy of reassurance, and they work a little, because hope is not a commodity, but a contagion. Meanwhile, the city begins to murmur. The live video, Clara's voice, and the ripples of people sharing and repeating begin to expand the frame. Some viewers call friends, some send links to local advocates, others text council members. Juliana, alone in her cell with the thin blanket and the small barred window, can feel the public attention gather outside like weather. But the machinery she is up against is not purely local. Corruption is a network. It is a set of expectations and buffers designed to defend itself. Bastos has friends who move furniture at the right times, who sign certain memos and look away when cameras are off. Amaral has paperwork bent to his convenience, and Ribeiro has muscle to make stories feel true. Behind them, if you look upward and back, there are men who prefer their deals to remain clean. Names start to surface, quiet mentions during the cell's small conversations: a businessman who funded festivals, a man known to the vendors as a generous sponsor of public events, Ricardo Araújo. Juliana files that name away with the care of someone starting a cross-connection. Rich men give with one hand and take with another. They pay for a smile and collect debts when the smile no longer costs them anything. She has seen it before in other cases: donations that function as burials for inconvenient truths, generosity that paves roads for impunity. The time in the cell feels elastic. Hours stretch and condense. In the dim, Juliana imagines the evidence she will need, not only the testimony of Antenor and the others, but a chain of material facts: photos, timestamps, the recorded live streams, the receipts, the pattern of phone calls that tie an officer to a businessman's name. She remembers the phrase a mentor once told her: corruption is loud once you find its rhythm. Find the rhythm and the music will change. She cannot create miracles. She cannot promise that institutions will leap into righteous action of their own accord. But she can prime them. She can become the patient needle that will allow the thread of public pressure to be stitched into formal proceedings. All of this requires patience, cunning, and an unwillingness to be intimidated by the kind of small cruelties that men like Bastos used to keep order. Juliana's resolve is not solitary. In the cell, the women share their small resistances: how they keep the receipts folded in a particular corner, a neighbor's habit of recording a conversation, the timestamps on a video saved to a memory card. Little accidental archives exist in pockets and drawer trays across the neighborhood. The problem has always been whether those archives find a way to speak to official power. Outside, Clara's livestream continues to draw viewers. The comments turn into a communal argument on what justice should look like.
Some call for immediate arrests, others demand an inquiry. A handful of viewers, skeptical and seasoned in the ways of the city, remind the feed to preserve evidence and not to let the prosecutor be accused of impropriety. Clara, unframed and human on a screen with cobblestone behind her, listens and moderates. Her voice is a kind of pressure. Later that afternoon, Juliana is brought before a desk. Amaral reads through a sheet that pretends to be an official charge. He uses a tone that is bland and institutional, one designed to strip away the human frailty of the moment. resisting arrest, disturbing the peace. The words are a coat of paint, thin and inadequate over what the day looked like in the market. Juliana plays the long game. She signs the forms with the right small movements, a name that makes the ledger tidy, and a face that accepts a temporary indignity for the sake of a larger truth. When she walks back to the cell, she carries with her the weight of what she has heard, and the faint electric hope that the public will not forget Antenor's face or Dona Lucia's hands. Inside the cell, a new piece of information arrives like a bird on a wire. A guard, irritated or sympathetic depending on the way you hear it, says something about a higher authority receiving calls. "Someone's calling the secretary," he mutters. The name of the office sounds distant and sterile, the sort of place people imagine as a series of grant proposals and meetings, not as a realm where a single hot call can stop a crooked chief's day. Still, Juliana hears it as a possibility. It is at this point that the precinct begins to show its small, improvisational fear. Bastos appears suddenly at the precinct doors, where he had seemed to be in control. His posture shifts, lines appearing around his eyes that were not there in the morning. He checks his phone. He fidgets in a way people do when their plays are seeing daylight. Juliana stays calm. The court of public opinion is not the law, but it is the pressure that makes law move. She pictures Clara's tiny rectangle of the world, the comments like waves, the numbers ticking upward. She imagines a superior's voice listening to a recording on speaker, and the effect of public voices joining the dots. If an institutional hand comes down, it must be done with evidentiary care. If it is purely performative, it will collapse. Juliana's mind is a ledger, balancing the risk of exposure against the benefit of an immediate lesson. Show the system that when you are abused, the system will do more than whisper a sympathy. That evening, the cell settles into its small human ritual, the exchange of a cigarette, a whisper about the price of medicine, a prayer that is not religious so much as practical. Please let my daughter keep her job. Juliana is the quiet center of those conversations. She is both recorder and confidant. She hears the barter of survival, the tiny ethics of shared food and borrowed hairpins.
These details carry weight in a case like this. They humanize victims in a way that numbers cannot. As the day closes, Juliana arranges the facts she has, dates, names, amounts, and the vital visual proof she suspects exists on someone's phone somewhere in the market. She begins to form a plan that is precise but not reckless. To expose a pattern, she needs corroboration that can survive a defense. The public outrage Clara is stirring serves as the necessary oxygen. The trick is to transform that oxygen into a legal imperative. At the close of her first night in the cell, Juliana looks at the women around her. She sees Antenor's face when they wheeled her past the stall. She hears Dona Lucia's steady enumeration of payments. She remembers how the officers laughed, like men who believe laughter is armor against consequence. She holds these images like evidence. She opens her mouth and tells them something she has not said aloud until now. I can't promise everything will change overnight, but I can promise I will not let you be invisible. The sentence is not a flourish. It is the compact she makes with herself and with them, the kind of vow that starts a long work. She fits the names together in her head as if assembling a map. Bastos, Ribeiro, Amaral, local nodes. Antenor and Dona Lucia, human coordinates. Ricardo Arruda, the shadowy patron whose name had been slipped like a card into an old coat pocket. The pattern is taking shape. She can see the silhouette of the network. Small payments, staged intimidations, a businessman's funding of public events that buys him goodwill, and the tacit enforcement by men who think their service comes with coupons for impunity. Morning will come with the same thin light that reveals not just human faces, but the architecture of an action. Juliana knows how to build pressure that is both public and procedural. She knows how to thread Clara's live stream into a formal complaint. She knows that she must gather the smallest details, because small things survive scrutiny. Timestamps, precise words, the kind of mistakes a corrupt apparatus makes when it is careless. When the guard brings breakfast, bread, butter, tea, Juliana takes the food with quiet gratitude. Food is proof of normalcy. She eats with the other women and listens to the officials shout on the corridor. Voices rise and fall like an operatic accompaniment to a civic drama. At some point mid-morning, someone passes through and drops a scrap of paper into the cell. A time, a name, a place. It is the kind of small, dangerous relay that makes investigations tossable. It reads like a breadcrumb. 7:30, third shift between the docks and the old gas station. 2 envelopes, black car parked a block away. Ricardo's men sign for the payments. The letter is unsigned. Juliana reads it twice. Her pulse accelerates the way a musician's does when a difficult passage finally clicks. She tucks the scrap away.
Proof begins to assemble itself, not as a single shining file, but as a slow accretion of notes and human voices. The market's outrage simmers into a kind of social pressure that is audible across the city's low register of attention. People begin to call the secretary's office. Clara keeps the feed live, and a map of comments flashes like a constellation. Juliana allows herself a small, private smile. The game is beginning. Her role is not to conquer, but to catalyze, to transform private harms into public responsibilities. She understands the danger. She understands that power resists. She understands, too, that when the network protecting a chief begins to fray, the chief panics and becomes inventive in his self-defense. The precinct is a theater of small, urgent choices. Detention officers exchange glances that mean something sharp. Maybe a boss will save them. Maybe the public will not care. They move with caution now. Bastos paces in clipped hands, checking his phone's messages, counting people around him like an accountant counts assets. He tries to fashion control where once there was certainty. Juliana sits and imagines the next move, the transfer of factual weight from an agitated feed to a sober letterhead. She imagines a call placed to the Secretary of Public Security, the voice of a superior picking up and listening to the scratch of a live feed on the other end. She imagines a recorded phone call played on speaker, the precise ring of authority making a man self-conscious about his own cruelty. She imagines the courage of a reporter and the small bravery of an older woman who refuses to let her life be reduced to a receipt. All of that is possible. All of that is contingent on how pieces fall. Juliana sifts through the contingency and chooses a path that is legal but bold, to remain undercover long enough to secure convincing narratives from those who had been threatened, to keep the live feed alight, and to call, when the time is right, the very voice that could reorder the precinct's culture. But she will not make that call until she is certain it will produce accountability, not a public relations arrangement. As she prepares, she lets the names accumulate inside her, like the clack of a safe door aligning. She repeats them quietly until they feel like a password. Antenor, Doña Lucia, Carla, Bastos, Ribeiro, Amaral, Ricardo Arruda. Each syllable locks in another fact. She knows the fragility of a case built on people's memories. She knows the strength of a case that ties those memories to documentary proof. The afternoon presses on. The chaotic rhythm of the city continues around the precinct, like a river on either side of a dam. Juliana paces the small perimeter of the cell with the patience of someone carving a path. She does not seek vindication for the slap. She seeks correction for the system.
When the time comes for the firstness of action, it will be a simple, ordinary move. A phone call placed and put on speaker at the right desk. A live video seeded into a judicial complaint by a reporter who has the courage to stay in the frame. And the small bravery of the victims willing to sign names to statements. A pattern is a series of small, connected events. To uproot a rotten tree, you begin by pulling at its roots. As evening bleeds into a city that knows how to cloak itself with shadow, the precinct's corridors hum with anticipation. They do not yet know the sound of their own fall. Juliana arranges the details she has like someone arranging letters to form a sentence. The sentence has to be precise and true. It must be more than outrage. It must be evidence that can stand in courtrooms and in the public squares. She leans against the cell bars for a moment, feeling the cold metal bite her palm. Outside, somewhere in the city, Clara's followers are still multiplying. People are beginning to come to the market again, not to forget, but to witness. They bring their cameras, their friends, their indignation. The market's rhythm is different now. Something new circles through it, a sense that the day's ordinary commerce now carries a moral freight. Juliana slips her hand into her tote and palms the scrap of paper with the dock's time and the black car. She breathes and thinks in lists and in people. She has bruises on her face and a strategy in her head. This is not the end of the tale. It is the moment the machinery of accountability is being primed. She walks back into the cell, where the women await. Their faces are open and raw, not seeking pity, but a practical response. She sits and tells them what she can promise: careful collection, witness statements, a willingness to take the evidence to those who have authority to act. They nod like people who have learned how to accept help when it is offered as work, not as charity. When she stands and leaves the room that first night, it is with the patience of someone who knows the value of small movements. She has not exposed herself, she has preserved her cover. She has not yet rung the bell that wakes the higher authority. She has gathered names, times, places, and the faint threads that make a web. Juliana walks through the precinct and pauses at a small window that looks down on the market square. The umbrella where Antenor stood is a torn flag. Its fabric flutters in the wind like a wounded thing. She imagines the vendor closing his hands over the small change he retains and thinks of the daughter who is learning letters. She thinks about what she will have to do to turn that small change into a durable answer. She holds in her hand the growing list of wounds and the plans to bind them with law and with publicity. Outside, lights from someone's phone flash like little beacons. Inside, the city's machinery turns. There will be calls to make, authorities to cajole and pressure.
There will be a moment when she will place a single phone on speaker and let the sound of the market be heard by someone with the authority to act. For now, she waits, notes arranged, resolve tempered. When she finally retires to the thin fold of sleep the cell affords, Juliana carries with her the weight of an oath, not made in public, but as real as any courtroom vow. She knows the risks: men who will try to protect themselves, men who will smear her name, men who will pile on legal technicalities to bury truth. She also knows the counterweight: witness courage, a reporter's live stream, a city waking to its responsibilities. The first move has been made. The slap that made her conspicuous has become the hinge. She sits, awake for a moment in the dim, and allows herself the image of the market's voice amplified, voices not content to be ignored. She catalogs what she will need in the days to come: recorded video, timestamps, supportive signatures, protective orders for the victims, and the willingness of someone in authority to listen when she calls. Outside, the city breathes on, ignorant of the precise mechanisms being put into motion. Inside, Juliana breathes too, steady and measured. She has gathered people, promises, and particulars. She has not yet made the revelation that will unmask both her identity and the web of power she seeks to expose. The revelation will have to wait until the evidence is airtight and the public pressure is just enough to make a superior act. For now, she is a quiet instrument among others, an undercover promoter who has been arrested by a corrupt officer. The arrest is the story's beginning, and the moment that will coalesce into a larger reckoning. She will not rush the collapse of the corrupt edifice. She will erode it with the steady drip of documented truth and public witness. She leaves the cell with more than a bruise on her cheek. She leaves with a ledger of names, with a promise that this will not be forgotten, and with a plan to turn the market's outrage into a formal chain of accountability. The small, necessary work of gathering evidence has only just begun. Outside, the live feed hummed like 1,000 small radios. The market's crowd swelled into a public, and the public makes demands it cannot always articulate, but it can point. Clara's followers multiplied. Strangers sent messages to the secretary's office, to local advocates, to civic groups that logged abuses like currency. Someone inside a neighborhood association sent a clip of the slap to a lawyer they trusted. A small coalition was forming without any one person claiming leadership. Inside the precinct, Bastus moved as if his control were a physical garment he could straighten. The neatness of his uniform mattered to him as much as any alibi. He paced, called his contacts, tried to manufacture narrative, but the threads he tugged at did not hold. The more he spoke into phones, the more his words revealed panic.
He barked at Ribeiro to keep a low profile. He ordered Amaral to prepare records that might suggest routine enforcement. The men felt the temperature change because the crowd outside, amplified by pixels and comments, had become an instrument. Juliana watched all of this like a surgeon watching blood flow after a cut. Clinical, strategic. She had a phone and a plan, and she kept both close. She had been careful about what she carried. No obvious legal pads, no official stationery, only a plain device with a weak battery and a list of names she had memorized. She had a contingency for a call, because in her real life, she kept a list of numbers she could reach without traces, numbers that led to people who could act quickly when necessary. She had always known a prosecutor's office is not merely a place that files charges. It is, sometimes, the single hinge by which a public system can be forced to react. Clara's feed registered another spike as a woman from the market recognized Antenor in the background and pointed the camera to his hands. He stood with a small, stubborn dignity, his hands curled into fists around a paper cone as if it were the only thing left to hold. Viewers flooded the comments with outrage. "We're coming," one read. "This is happening in my neighborhood too," wrote another. The shape of public attention was no longer a rumor. It was evidence of concern. Antenor had not returned home that morning with plans to fight. He had intended to keep his stall, to fix its umbrella, to bring home enough for medicine and a little dinner for his daughter. But when Clara's phone tilted back to show the torn fabric and the policeman's boot prints near the cart, something shifted. Someone recognized a man who had been kind to a neighbor that week and posted a picture of his daughter's school uniform. Connections multiplied. Faces were not anonymous anymore.
She did not shout. She trusted the camera's quiet correctness. She was assaulted. People saw it. Outside, the live count ticked upward. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then a surge that turned into a small tidal event. The precinct was a fragile stage. Bastos tried to spin, but spin breaks when there is a visual anchor and several people willing to narrate what they saw. The image of a chief slapping a woman on a market street has a weight that a memo cannot cancel. Inside, Juliana listened and timed. She had already gathered the testimony she needed. She had secured the names and the scrap about the black car. She had asked small favors from people she met in the cell, someone who knew a route, a face who had seen a car plate. A neighbor had, in a different exchange, shown a short clip taken from the other end of the market that included a grainy frame of a dark sedan idling across the street. The plate was half covered, but the last three characters were visible. The car's make and a chipped bumper were distinct. To anyone who followed the network of favors in that neighborhood, small differences became big patterns. Juliana slid the phone out of her coat and dialed a number that sat on the periphery of her memory. The Secretary of Public Security's direct line. It was a bold move, daring because it would either trigger a slow bureaucratic response or force immediate confrontation. Juliana counted the risk. If she succeeded, the precinct's theater might flip into an inquiry. If she failed, she might become a target. She had prepared for both. The call connected. Someone answered with the kind of courtesy that carries authority. Secretary's office. Juliana put the phone on speaker and let the room inhale her voice. She spoke not as a citizen, but with the composed tone of someone who knew legal weight. "This is Juliana Morais," she said. For the first time since the slap, she used her real name on a public line. Her identity was a lever. The name landed like the beginning of a weight. There was a pause, brief and clinical, the split second where someone in power decides whether the voice on the other end will be utility or nuisance. Then the secretary's voice, measured, curious, with a hint of an assistant's caution, asked for details. Juliana told the story in brief, precise fragments. Where, who, what time, the live stream link, the market vendor's name, the names of the officers. She asked directly for an immediate internal inquiry and for the corregidoria to be dispatched to the precinct. Bastos in the next room felt the floor move. He heard Juliana's name rustle like a net. The man who had built his certainty on small cruelties heard the title Juliana Morais and the word prosecutor and felt the authority tilt. His posture tightened because the figure who had been a ma'am in his rough accounting was suddenly an actor with resources. He checked his phone, then looked to Amaro, who no longer smiled.
Juliana left the call on speaker. She did not demand miracles. She did not shout. She simply allowed the secretary's voice to enter the precinct's hum through a handset that everyone could hear. The call was a public instrument. The secretary asked for confirmation, asked for the live link, asked whether the police could preserve the scene. A thread of official language, simple and bureaucratic, slid into the room. "We are sending internal affairs." It sounded less like a victory and more like a mechanism beginning to turn. Bastos tried to intercept. "We can handle this internally," he said, his voice attempting a level of calm it did not possess. "No," the secretary said, firmly. "Internal affairs will investigate, preserve the scene, preserve evidence. Do not release detainees connected to this incident until further notice." The word "further notice" became a barrier. It implied oversight. It implied that someone with a higher office was watching the precinct's choreography. Bastos swallowed and masked his panic with a curt, clipped "yes, sir." He looked at his subordinates in a way that suggested the hours ahead would be long, and not in his favor. The arrival of internal affairs, Corregoria, was theatrical but necessary. The team moved with the procedural efficiency of people trained to attend to what power conceals. They wore neutral jackets, carried cameras, and marched with the mechanical calm of investigators who could stand in a room and let the truth be uncomfortable. Bastos tried to produce paperwork, to arrange a narrative that might frame Juliana as the provocateur. The investigators were careful. They listened to voices, took notes, and spoke with a detachment that felt like procedure but would later be read as impartiality. In the corridor, the scene shifted. Cameras were taken to the market's footage, the live stream was logged, and a request was issued for all available recordings, including a grainy clip a shopkeeper had been saving for months because he feared unjust seizures, stuff he might now find useful. The clip showed more than a slap. It showed days earlier a dark car repeating the precinct's pattern at times when small payments were reported. The shopkeeper's camera was not glamorous, but its timestamp was real. Investigators cross-checked the car's partial plate with municipal records. They found a registration tied to a company that provided sponsorships to public events under Ricardo Arruda's name. The link between a businessman and a municipal supplier was a common civic seam, but what investigators needed was the pattern. Payments made to a front company, envelopes delivered in lanes behind the market, the same officers present when the exchanges occurred. Paper trails do not always glow. They are often plain, pedestrian things like receipts, invoices, and bank slips. The trick is to watch for repetition. Juliana watched as patterns she had felt in her gut became visible.
A shopkeeper's clip, Antanor's shaky video taken on a phone, Clara's live feed, the scrap with the docs and the black car. All of it was being aligned with something less subjective. Timestamps, registries, a vehicle record that named a corporate shell. The Corregedoria moved in the same way quiet surgeons do. Not theatrical, not vengeful, but methodical and inevitable. They arrested Bastos, Ribeiro, and Amaral in a sequence that felt both immediate and sanctioned. The men were taken, fingers cuffed, faces startled, and walked through the precinct in a slow, humiliating parade. Bastos shouted about injustice, which sounded like a man who was discovering the cost of his own narrative. Ribeiro tried to be defiant until hands closed around him. Amaral, ever the bureaucrat, kept asking if someone would email him the charge sheet so he could compare the wording with what he had predicted. The crowd outside watched as a pocket of official life changed shape. Clara's feed spiked again. The comments poured in. "Finally, about time. We watched this for years." Antanor watched too, but he watched with an expression that was less triumph than relief, as if his bones were finally tending to a long ache. Arrests were a beginning, not an ending. Detaining the men who executed extortion did not explain who paid for it. The Corregidoria's presence suggested a broader inquiry. Investigators turned quickly to the question Juliana had kept like a careful map in her head. Who benefited from the pattern of staged intimidation? They had a name in the margins, Ricardo Arruda. Arruda was not a street boss. He was a man whose signature appeared on civic initiatives, whose logo was on festival banners, and whose charity photos warmed press releases. He had cultivated the right friendships, sat on the right boards, and wrote checks that made events happen. He was, in public, a benefactor. In the margins, the pattern often was different. Small payments, veneer contracts for production companies that existed on paper, and men in uniforms who benefited when favors were called in. Investigators requested Arruda's records. A raid on a nondescript downtown office produced a wall of files and a set of USB drives labeled with the kinds of names corrupt men use to obscure the obvious. There were invoices for event staging that listed ghost vendors, bank transfers multiplicative and circuitous, and emails that threaded the same language used in the precinct's files. The same hand that wrote sponsorship also wrote reimbursement. But the evidence needed to tie Arruda directly to Bastos demanded more than accounting. It needed a human link. That link came in part from an unlikely witness, a contract driver who had hauled equipment for a festival. He remembered being paid in cash for certain nights and of dropping off envelopes at a small restaurant near the docks.
His recollection line matched the scrap note Juliana had found in the cell. Black car, third shift, the docks.
and that scrap was suddenly a key. A careful cross-check of the driver's recollection with the shopkeeper's timestamps, the bank's tracing of a particular wire that had left Aruta's company on the same day, and the grainy footage of the dark sedan produced a tight frame. It showed, in short, how money could move from a man many admired to the hands that enforced his ease. It showed that the festival's glitter had a backroom ledger, and that ledger paid for conveniences. Investigators played a recording they had found, a short, clipped phone call between an assistant of Aruta and a man who used the kind of code Bastos favored, nouns that were actually envelopes. The conversation was routine, banal, and therefore damning. Aruta's defense would later say he never authorized illegality. The record, even in its plainness, said otherwise. The system had been bought with small things: envelopes, favors, the steady hush of ordinary corruption. When warrants were executed, Aruta's office was not the place of fiery confrontation. It was the place of legal formality. Agents with lists, men with badges, papers served with the courtesy of someone used to a courtroom rather than a street fight. He was detained and questioned, his face a mixture of incredulity and calculation. He attempted, predictably, to frame the payments as legitimate business expenses. Investigators cataloged emails, receipts, and contradictory notes that undercut the official narrative. The net drew tighter. The story that started with a slapped woman eating at a market became a procession of small truths that together compelled institutional action. Arrests were made not as a spectacle, but as a consequence of alignment between a live stream, witness testimony, shopkeeper recordings, a scrap of paper, and an official who would listen when the right voice spoke on the line. Juliana did not collapse the system alone. She had catalyzed public attention and threaded it into a prosecutorial mechanism that had the tools to follow the money. Victims were released from the precinct with official papers, protective orders, forms that meant they could not be harassed for the same allegations they had been forced to sign. A public defender was present. A social worker waited in the corridor with a list of immediate supports, temporary housing options, medical referrals, and a small stipend so vendors could replace lost stock. It was not a grand remedy, but it was, for the moment, practical. Stamps of help that meant a person could sleep easier that night. Antenor was given a formal apology by a municipal liaison, a small check to cover damages, and assistance in applying for a permanent vending permit.
The city, in the heat of public embarrassment, moved quickly to avoid further scandal. It made a visible commitment to review practices and to allocate funds for small business protections in the market districts. It was not the end, and Juliana knew that reparations are often temporary. But for Antenor, the money and the permit were a literal chance to keep the roof over his daughter's head. Carla received counseling and a legal advocate to assist in challenging the coerced confession they had tried to extract. The city provided a protective regimen so she would not be targeted again while the investigation proceeded. Dona Lucia was connected to a pharmacist who would deliver medication at subsidized cost for a few months while the city assessed longer-term support. These were not grand social programs, but they were stitches in a small and immediate net. Juliana watched these outcomes in the hushed rooms of the courtroom corridors, where people signed forms and waited for cameras to move on. She did not relish the attention. She let others take the podium for now. She stayed at the edge, listening to the names and the details, so the story could be written without error. She had been arrested to see the systems in motion. Now she watched those systems respond. The press conference that followed was a study in calibrated language. The Secretary of Public Security expressed regret and a commitment to transparency. The Corregidoria presented factual findings, preserved footage, witness statements, bank records, the chain from Aruta's office to the precinct. Words like investigation ongoing and institutional reform appeared in a careful script. Juliana listened for promises that had teeth. She asked quiet questions to the public defenders and the social workers about follow-up and oversight. Rhetoric without follow-through was dangerous. She wanted a mechanism, not mere contrition. In the weeks that followed, the task force they established set up visible changes. Cameras were mounted in several market squares and in precinct corridors where possible, with strict policies about access to the footage. A hotline was advertised that connected vendors directly to municipal legal aid. A small oversight board with citizen representation was convened to review similar complaints and to advise on patterns. These measures were not a cure. They were scaffolding, structures to help keep public pressure on long enough for investigations to be exhaustive. Legal proceedings moved forward. Charges were filed against the officers involved, and an indictment named Aruta as part of a conspiracy to purchase control and protection over market operations. The indictment was dense with dry legal language, the kind Juliana had learned to respect, and it recited dates, sums, names, and timestamps. It was for the victims a legal translation of their pain into prosecutable acts.
Scenes from the courtroom filled evenings on local channels and the feeds of residents who had watched Clara's original clip. Bastos and Ribeiro sat in suits that did not fit well. Their faces were thinner in the fluorescent light of public scrutiny. Aruta's lawyer framed the charges as a misunderstanding of business practice and protested about investigative overreach. But in the public's eye, the story had already moved beyond his spin. His philanthropy sheen had been scratched. In quieter spaces, Juliana worked with prosecutors and investigators to ensure the case was strong. She provided the context and insisted on rigorous chain of custody protocols for the market footage and the shopkeeper's camera. She insisted that victims be protected from intimidation as charges amassed. It was, she knew, the slow and tedious work that makes public anger into legal consequence. She wrote memos and made calls and reviewed depositions. She allowed the tempo of the law to determine the pace of the action. No triumphalism, only procedure. A week after the arrests, the market held a small ceremony. It was not a victory parade. It was an attempt to stitch back the ordinary. Antenor's old cart was gone, replaced by a small food truck painted a bright color that made the square seem kinder. The city contributed startup funds as part of restitution. A local cooperative offered training in business practices and accounting. Neighbors stood in line for the first hot fritters. Their faces held the wary hope of people who had endured many false dawns. Donna Lucia came to the truck and put a trembling hand on Antenor's shoulder. Carla, accompanied by an advocate, sat to the side and watched the bustle with a look of cautious relief. Juliana found herself watching them take small joys she had not paid for, but had fought to protect. She felt gratitude that was not triumphalist. It was heavy and appropriate. The city announced the creation of a permanent task force composed of municipal officials, members from civil society, and independent auditors. It was a concession to structural change, an admission that problems require ongoing attention. The task force planned to audit precincts, review patterns of public events funding, and implement an education program for vendors about their rights. It was again not a cure-all, but a framework. Professional consequences flowed as the investigation advanced. Some officers were suspended pending trial. Amaral's paperwork was subjected to forensic review. Many of his neat, false lines were examined with the patience of a tax accountant and the scrutiny of a moralist. The company connected to Aruta's payments was audited. Irregular transactions were identified, and several corporate officers became subjects of inquiry. Arrests and indictments followed, but the public was cautioned. Indictments are not convictions, and law must be done carefully. Juliana returned to the market months later, no longer in disguise.
She walked with a plain handbag and a small, deliberate modesty. The music vendors played the same songs, and the smell of frying oil was now a kind of everyday liturgy. People approached her, not with blame, not with a need to think, but with small human encounters. A vendor who offered a sample, a mother who wanted to tell her child that a woman had made sure her stall would not be taken. A man who had once muttered in the corner now offered a steady handshake. Clara's reporting continued. She followed the trial, the hearings, and the municipal changes. Her camera traced the arc from the slap to the courtroom with a seriousness that resisted spectacle. The feeds that had once been quick with outrage were now repositories of detail, film of hearings, and interviews with social workers. The story had become a beat, a civic responsibility she kept alive with sober examination. Juliana did not become a celebrity. She did not seek the spotlight. She took depositions, she gave testimony, and she met with victims to ensure their cases were strong. She also wrote policy briefs, met with the task force, and pushed for clearer complaint lines and better oversight. Her role changed. What began as undercover observation turned into a committed public practice of law and advocacy. She had, she told herself, moved from observing cruelty to building a system that could resist it. There were setbacks. Some witnesses recanted under pressure, and some legal motions threatened to slow the wheels of justice. Aruta's legal team fought hard. They appealed, they questioned chains of custody, and they tried to make victims into unreliable narrators. The trial's progress was not inevitable. Juliana spent nights drafting responses, preparing for cross-examination, and ensuring victims had protection orders in place. She understood the pace of law and the patience it demanded. The community's attention waxed and waned. The feeds that had thrummed with fury grew quieter some days. Citizens returned to jobs and family obligations. The market resumed its banal, persistent commerce, with customers buying the same fritters and the same fruits as if nothing had happened, while at the same time everything had changed. Permits were issued with more transparency, cameras preserved potential evidence, and vendors organized themselves into a committee with legal help. In the months that followed, indictments became trials, and trials produced verdicts. Some defendants were convicted, others were acquitted or had charges reduced. The legal system, as Juliana had long expected, produced mixed results, convictions for some, plea bargains for others. The outcomes were not neat. The city's efforts to reform procedurally bore fruit in spots: clearer reporting channels, a small rise in resolved complaints, and a modest increase in the rights education offered to informal workers.
Where the system worked, it did so because many people had acted together. A reporter who refused to stop filming, a vendor who called for help, a shopkeeper who kept a camera, a prosecutor who chose risk, an assistant prosecutor who followed up with the bank records, a corregedoria that acted on the evidence. The arc from small shame to institutional accountability is long and uneven, but it is conceivable when people assemble the right materials and refuse to look away. Arruda's case became emblematic. The man who had been celebrated in glossy photos faced a stain that did not wipe easily. His business had to restructure. His public relations team could not keep rewriting the narrative. He paid fines, his company was fined, and he faced ultimately restrictions on doing business with municipal contracts. He also faced the social consequence of lost honor. The kind of reputation that funds public applause was now frail. He tried to rebuild financially, but he could not easily rebuild the trust he had bought with envelopes. In quiet moments, Juliana thought about what justice meant in a larger sense. She knew that removing corrupt actors did not fix the conditions that allowed them: poverty, institutional complacency, the casual acceptance of small bribes as a market's cost of doing business. She kept pushing for structural changes: better municipal oversight of sponsorships, transparent chains of public procurement, and accessible legal advice for vendors. For Antenor, the changes were tangible. His food truck, with its new permit and municipal registration, allowed him to work without daily fear of being seized or extorted. He hired a neighbor's son to help, and his daughter pinned a small drawing of letters on the truck side. He laughed more openly, quietly, in ways that made Juliana's chest unclench. For Dona Lucia, the medication arrived. For Carla, a job training program opened a door. Small recoveries, not miracles. Juliana kept an office at the prosecutor's headquarters and continued to pursue patterns that a single arrest could not cut. She supported workshops teaching vendors about their rights, and she pushed for funds to be allocated for legal aid. Her life simplified around the purpose that had first sent her into disguise: to make sure that when the powerful acted, there were mechanisms that could respond. One afternoon, months after the market incident, she walked through the square and found a small memorial, a piece of ribbon tied to the new truck's awning with a scrap of paper that read simply, "For dignity." It was a modest artifact, but it meant something real. People had tied their history into an object, a way to remember not only their pain, but the fact that pain can, imperfectly, be acknowledged. At a public forum convened to discuss the market's reforms, Juliana spoke quietly and plainly. She refused to claim absolutes. "We have a long road," she said. "This is not the end."
People who profit from fear change tactics. We will have to keep watching. Her voice did not seek applause. It sought an understanding. Accountability is a process that requires vigilance and civic participation. She also insisted on gratitude to the small acts that had made a difference: Clara's camera, Antenor's call, the shopkeeper's clip, Dona Lucia's testimony. She honored those acts not as footnotes, but as the materials of civic power. The public, she said, must remain a participant in democracy, not merely an audience. The court cases wound on. Some defendants were given sentences that included community service and mandates to attend ethics training. Some negotiated plea deals that required them to cooperate with further investigations. Arruda faced civil suits and sanctions that hampered his ability to secure municipal contracts. Conscience, the law's slow engine, had turned to a degree. Juliana's bruise healed into a memory of a day that had been cruel and clarifying. People still asked if she regretted her decision to remain undercover. She thought about the nights in the cell, the lists she had made, and the calculation that powered her choice. She answered consistently. She did not regret gathering truth in the only way it would reveal itself. She did not relish deception any more than she enjoyed the slap, but she believed that sometimes, when institutions do not see their own failures, someone must bring them light from inside. She continued to meet vendors at tables at dawn, to eat fritters that now tasted like the ordinary life they defended. The market's rhythms resumed their old, necessary music: a hawker calling a price, a child chasing a coin, the clink of a coffee cup. But there was also a steadier sense that the market's people could call for help and not feel alone.
In time, Juliana moved from undercover missions to training others in how to document abuses, how to preserve evidence, and how to create small, durable archives of wrongs. It was less dramatic than an arrest in a market, but she found the work deserved attention. Training meant multiplication. She taught people to keep receipts, to note times, to save recordings, and to make their stories resistant to erasure. It was quiet work that increased civic power. The city's task force published a report that recommended permanent changes: clearer procurement oversight, mandatory recording of confiscations, a revision to the permit process for vendors, and a hotline that linked complaints directly to independent monitors. The report did not promise an end to corruption. It promised steps toward resilience. Months later, in a courtroom where the walls smelled of polished wood and legal coffee, the judge read a sentence for one of the lower-ranking officers. Justice in that room was not a trumpet. It was the measured application of law. The crowd outside the court cheered quietly. It was a polite, human sound.
There was no triumphant music, only the relief of a small, legally ordered conclusion. Juliana stood in the doorway as people left the courthouse and felt the weight of the long fight ahead. She looked at the faces of those who had suffered and those who had supported them. She thought of Clara, who had become not only a reporter, but a chronicler of public wrongs. She thought of the market's new awning, of Antenor's daughter with her schoolbooks, and of the many small, undramatic acts that had become the scaffolding of change. She did not imagine that the city was wholly cleansed. She had seen how quickly systems adapt. She imagined instead a durable vigilance, cameras that were handled with respect, a public that had learned to call out and to document, a judiciary that could be prompted to act with diligence. Justice, she had learned, is not an event, but a habit. At the close of one public hearing, a young vendor approached Juliana. He had been silent in the long weeks of trial. He shook her hand and, in a voice that trembled with both pride and fatigue, said, "You stayed. You listened." He did not offer more than what was true. It was enough. The human cost had been paid. The response, imperfect as it was, had been made. Juliana looked out over the square that evening as the sun turned the market's awnings gold. She felt the city's pulse slow in a way that was not complacent, but content. She thought about the long work she would continue: policy briefs, community training, the pursuit of those who think they can buy impunity. She thought about the roles people play: the vendors' small daily labor, the reporters' persistent camera, the investigators' methodical lists, the prosecutors' patient papers. The case had changed many lives. It had also shown to everyone watching that accountability could be forced when ordinary acts, phone calls, videos, testimonies, were collected and presented with care. It had shown that the law could act if enough people demanded it, and if someone inside the system was willing to gather the evidence when the system did not. It had also shown the limit of one person's action. Reforms require sustained attention and collective will. Weeks later, a small plaque appeared near Antenor's truck. It read, "For dignity and for those who would not look away." People walked by and touched it. Some took selfies. The market had its ordinary commerce, and now its memory. Juliana remained at the prosecutor's office, working the long hours and meeting with those who came to tell their stories. She took no credit for the reforms that followed. She understood the necessary humility of sustained civic work. She kept notes in legal folders and in her head, and she taught others how to turn small things into proof. When the dust settled enough for a quiet moment, she sat at a small table near the market and ate a fried fritter Antenor insisted she take for free.
Her cheek ached sometimes when she slept, a small echo of the slap. But more than the ache was a kind of quiet resolve, the knowledge that the work had to continue and that it took many hands to make institutions just. She had walked into the market as a passerby and been arrested as an ordinary woman. The world had watched her, who bore a badge in the public square, be humbled, and, in that humiliation, the city had found a reason to look harder.
The shocking twist, the revelation that the arrested woman was a public promoter and a prosecutor who would not be silenced, had done more than surprise. It had catalyzed a series of responses that would be difficult to undo. The fight, she knew, would not end with a sentence or a press release. It would continue in the small daily practices of accountability, in vendor education, in oversight committees, and in the careful work of prosecutors and reporters. It would continue because citizens learned that looking away cost something they no longer wanted to pay. And so she kept working. She trained a cohort of junior prosecutors and community liaisons. She advised the task force. She answered calls from vendors at odd hours and sat with families that needed help. She watched the trials and annotated their mistakes so that future cases would be stronger. She did not imagine herself victorious. She imagined herself part of a network that might, someday, make abuse harder to sustain. One evening, as the square emptied and the food truck's lights dimmed, Clara found Juliana and sat with her on a low wall. "You ever think about writing a book?" Clara asked, half a joke, half a reflection. Juliana laughed, quietly. "I think about system maps and memos," she said. "Books take time." Clara smiled and tapped her phone. "For now, we keep documenting. We keep making sure the next person who gets a slap has someone on the other side of the phone." They watched a boy chase a coin across the square. The city breathed. The market folded its awnings. People went home with a little more hope than they had before, and with the unease of knowing the work was not finished. If you were moved by this story and want to keep following investigations like these, share this video with someone who cares about justice, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your voice matters, and the work of accountability grows when people refuse to look away.